So what we're doing here is we're going through the Sermon on the Mount. 1 year, one message. I got to tell you, though, we will take Advent and Lent off. So just if you come here in a couple weeks, the last Sunday of November is Advent, and say, "What's up, Taylor? We're leaving the sermon. We're going to have a break there, but we'll be back last Sunday of December and going through May, all the way up to Pentecost." But just to catch you up on where we've been, we've talked about the Beatitudes and the blessings that Jesus starts with, and then the call to be salt and light. But really, the phrase we looked at last week when Jesus said, "You've heard it said, I have not come to abolish the law, but I've come to fulfill the law, and unless your righteousness exceeds the scribes and the Pharisees, you'll never enter the kingdom of heaven." Everything that follows comes from that preface, if you will, that Jesus is now going to speak about what it looks like to live this life of the kingdom. We've been calling it guerrillas of grace, moving out with this revolutionary call that comes from the inside out with a law that's written on our hearts, as opposed to the outside in, a law of stone that we read from the outside and keep our scorecard going. It's radical. It's revolutionary. It's the hope of the world. You have heard that it was said of those of ancient times, "You shall not murder, and whoever murders shall be liable to judgment." But I say to you that if you are angry with a brother or sister, you will be liable to judgment. And if you insult a brother or sister, you will be liable to the council. And if you say, "You fool," you will be liable to the fire, the hell of fire. So when you are offering your gift at the altar, if you remember that your brother or sister has something against you, leave your gift there before the altar and go. First be reconciled to your brother or sister, and then come and offer your gift. Come to terms quickly with your accuser while you are on the way to court with him, or your accuser may hand you over to the judge, and the judge to the guard, and you will be thrown into prison. Truly, I tell you, you will never get out until you have paid the last penny. Thanks be to God for this His holy word. Amen. This morning we do wake up with another hangover from the violence that shakes our world. 129 people dead in Paris at this point. Probably more in critical condition will die. And the killers shout, "God is great," as they blow away people in soccer stadiums, music halls, and restaurants. It makes you want to kill, doesn't it? Find somebody to blame and go murder them. It would be justified. It would be sanctified. And we all end up killing each other. The Sermon on the Mount has a different way. It's the way of the kingdom, a way of hope, a way on the surface looks like an unlivable law. But as we drill down deeper today and in our lives, it is the only way that will bring us any hope of blessedness, any hope of peace, and any comfort for those who mourn. Jesus is asking us to live lives that are authentic, where what is on the inside is reflected on the outside. He is asking us to take off the masks and recognize that the person that we present ourselves to be in public needs to be the person that we are in private. And even deeper, it needs to be the person that we are in our secret self that we let nobody else see. There is anger in insult that travels below what is seen. And that is damaging as hell to us, and few of us recognize us. He asks us to recognize our anger and to understand that in the conflicts in our relationships, we are committing murder. And he asks us not to ignore them. And radical obedience calls us to take very specific steps to straighten out broken relationships before they end up in murder or before they end up in court. Last week we said that Jesus gives us all the preface to all that follows in the Sermon on the Mount, a righteousness that exceeds that of the scribes and the Pharisees. And this week he starts to unpack what that looks like. It's not the letter of the law, but the spirit of the law that he's inviting people to live into, his disciples, those who listen to him on the Mount. The pattern emerges threefold. First, Jesus introduces the Old Testament passage and says, "You have heard that it was said." The language that's used there is called the divine passive, implying that this is the law that comes from God. This is what God intended. But then the next thing he says is the way that current popular practices are interpreting that law that miss the mark of what God intended. And then finally he says, "But I say to you, there's a new way. There's a new way." Now, the challenge of what Jesus says to those people when he says, "I say to you," is the challenge that puts him on the same level with God. And that's what people had problems with. That's what got Jesus killed. But Jesus is saying, I know what God intended when he gave the law. And let me teach you what God intends for your life today to live that law. And again, we're saying this is not a law that crushes and kills, that we can never measure up to, which of course, none of us can measure up to this when we read it, but this is a law that is given to us for life. And anger and conflict will kill us. And Jesus has the words of life. But the question today is the same as it was then. Will you believe him? Because if Jesus is just another ethical teacher that has some pretty good ideas about how we might try to get through the days that we live on this earth, we can take what we want to take and we can live the rest. But when he says, I say to you, and if he's saying that as the Son of God, the Messiah, then we need to understand that our lives are called to live radically into the obedience that he calls us to. If that's the case, probably everybody should go somewhere right now, right? If you're coming to worship and you know that somebody has something against you, interesting, isn't it, that he didn't say if you have something against somebody else, but he says if somebody has something against you, leave your gift, turn around, go, and be reconciled. I mean, I think all of us have a text we need to send, have a call we need to make, or a visit that we need to do. If Jesus is who he said he is, this is the 8th step of the 12 steps, right? Make a list of persons who we have harmed and become willing to make amends to them. It doesn't come just from the big book. It comes from the good book, because that comes from Jesus. And I'm not saying that today anybody will try to do this with what's happened in Paris. Nobody is going to go to ISIS and say, we just don't understand. I mean, we know you have something against us. The West, Christians, other Muslims who aren't in the same camp as they are, everybody. Jesus would say today, go to ISIS and sit down and be reconciled. Anybody willing to sign up for that duty today? You can already start to read the editorial comments that says, we just need to all get together, blow them apart, and let God sort it out. Ginny Young, one of our members here, has been in Oman this week. I think she's home. I think she may have come home yesterday. But she worked with Doug Leonard, who's at the Oman Center, at the El-Aman Center in Oman. And I can only imagine how much more difficult Doug Leonard's job has been made by what happened this week in Paris. He is trying to bring together Muslims and Christians and Jews and people of the world in a way of peace. If you remember, Doug Leonard was here and he preached a couple months ago. And he preached on Ephesians 2, which says, Christ is our peace. And he stood up here and he said that Christ is the only hope of peace. And I wondered how that would play with some of the Muslim counterparts that he works with. But what he is saying is that the way of Christ is the way of peace. The way of the Sermon on the Mount is the way of peace. To love your enemies. To pray for those who despitefully use you. As Doug shares that process with Muslims or anybody else, there are people whose eyes light up with the truth that is the only way of hope out of this mess we're in. But really, it's easy to focus on the hard stuff, isn't it, today? It's easy to kind of say something that's beyond our control, beyond what we can touch, that's out there way beyond our authority to address. And then what do? We avoid the stuff in Hopewell. We avoid the stuff in our homes. We avoid the secret things in our lives that need to come clean and be addressed. We were talking about this text this week at staff meeting, and Wes Joseph brought up a famous G.K. Chesterton quote. G.K. Chesterton was asked with other theologians and philosophers of his time by the London Times, please answer this question, what's wrong with our world? Philosophers wrote pages. Theologians wrote tomes. But Chesterton wrote 2 words. He said, I am. Until we recognize that the ways of peace start in our lives, that the invitation of the Sermon on the Mount is to be guerrillas of grace moving into this world, those who've been transformed by the grace of Jesus Christ on the inside and on the out, begin to live with a way of hope in a world that's gone crazy. And Jesus does it here. And we'd say, please, Lord, ease up a little bit. Says, not only should you not take a knife and stick it in somebody's front, you shouldn't take a knife and stick it in somebody's back. Somebody that you're angry against. If you insult your brother or your sister, you are liable to judgment. And if you say you are a fool, you will be liable to the fires of hell. Come on, Jesus, ease up here a bit, won't you? We've been talking about how the Sermon on the Mount is the upside-down kingdom, and Jesus is turning what we think we understand on its head. Power is turned into weakness. Mourning is turned into comfort. Those kind of things. But don't you feel a little bit like his progression is off here? Otherwise, the Taconic Parkway becomes a highway to hell, doesn't it? How many times have you been willing to call somebody a fool or an idiot? That's what it means when you're driving. Come on. That guy's a jerk. That guy's a jerk. And we have tragic stories of what Jesus is talking about. That what starts with a fool, unwilling to recognize somebody created in the image of a God, can progress to where that anger destroys us and maybe destroys somebody else. Is that what Jesus wants to do? Scare the hell out of us? Bring back judgment so that we will never drive aggressively again? No, I believe that Jesus is consistent in what he's saying, is that there needs to be an authenticity in the way we live that's reflected from the inside out. That we may not stab or curse with our lips publicly, but when we go home, we keep a tally of those folks that we think are fools, those people that we are angry with. And that anger, says Jesus, is as destructive as murder. And guess who it's killing? It's killing us inside. I guess my wife and I are getting a little older. Is that true? Well, now we have no kids at home at dinner time, so a lot of times we watch the news. And sometimes, that's when we've really given up hope, we eat our dinner in front of the TV. I think that's a bad mistake. One, it's a bad mistake because of the news that comes on the TV. But two, it's a bad mistake because of the commercials that are on TV with the news. You understand the demographic of who watches the evening news still? People with arthritis, or they need Viagra, or their bones are broken, or their bowels are messed up, or something. And whatever has happened, the FDA makes us say all these. Remember that this could cause you to scream off the top of a cliff, commit suicide, chop your head off, and die in the meantime. But the worst one is the one for shingles. I don't know if you've seen it, but a guy comes out to play golf, and he says, "I'm not really feeling it today," and he lifts up the side of his shirt, and there's just all this red, raw stuff of skin, like, oh, please pass the bread, you know? But they say something like this, that if you've ever had the chicken pox, the shingles virus is inside of you, and it can come out. I'm getting that vaccine. I mean, we've all had the chicken pox, right? I mean, that commercial scares me. But I think that's what Jesus is saying right here. That if this anger is inside of you, you may think you're keeping it squashed down, but it's going to come out. And you need to deal with it. If that means you need to be reconciled, you need to be reconciled, and it's important enough that you don't even worship. You go and do what you need to do to straighten things out, because that virus can come out, and it can destroy you. Our world is looking for authenticity, where what's on the inside is the same thing that's portrayed on the outside. I will be going to a Faithwalking event in Houston this week. 3 years ago I went. It was a powerful, powerful experience for me. But one of the things they talk about there in the Faithwalking event is looking through the Johari window. The Johari window. Think about this. Very simple, 4 quadrants. One quadrant of the window is what I know about me and what you know about me. That's our authentic self. That's what's lived out there in front of everybody. The second thing is what I know about me, but you don't know about me. The things that I keep hidden in my private self that I don't want anybody to know. The third one is what you know about me that I don't know about me. That I still need God to reveal to me. And as brothers and sisters in Christ, we're called to do that with each other in the way that we live. And finally, the things that I don't know about me and you don't know about me, the things that only God knows about me, that still need to be revealed. I've had some things revealed to me that I didn't know about me by good brothers and sisters in the Christian faith that have opened my life up to deeper growing and deeper loving. Important to see. But the world is looking for authentic people that don't live behind false selves, but live consistent and integrated lives that are authentic. In the paper on Thursday, they reported about Bill Cosby, that new cases are being raised and civil libel suits are being brought against him. There's an example of somebody that we thought we knew in his public self that had no connection with his private self. You know I'm a Dylan fan, right? I mean, one of the things I love about Dylan is I think Dylan's authentic. You can argue with me about that. But one of my favorite songs is Positively 4th Street. And he talks about how inauthentic our relationships can be. I don't know if you guys plan this for today. Probably you'll never sing it in worship. But he says, you see me on the street, you always act surprised. You say, how are you? Good luck. But you don't mean it. When you know as well as me, you'd rather see me paralyzed. Why don't you come out once and just scream it? Dylan is asking for authenticity. I'm not going to say Dylan is like Jesus because you'll skewer me for that one, right? But Jesus is saying we need to have our interior self match our exterior self. We talk about that in Faithwalking as well. You know, our public self, you know what it is. You're coming to church on Sunday morning. You get out of the car, and right before you step up those steps, you go like this. You go like this. How are you doing? I'm fine. Well, what your private self knows and what your family knows is you couldn't get the kids out of the house that morning. There was a big fight on the way to church. You were screaming in the car. You closed the door of the car, and you put it on. Right? That's the private self. The self that maybe your family sees, maybe those in your small group see, but the private self that you want to keep closed. And then there's a secret self that nobody knows. Those are the recesses of pornography, or cheating on our taxes, or things that we never want other people to know. But Jesus says all those things, if left inside like that shingles virus, will come out and destroy. So here's the invitation today. The invitation that calls you to be authentic in your relationships. There's going to be times of conflict and times when you want to call somebody a fool. But Jesus is saying, address those. Deal with those. There may be some work you have to do today. Because I don't want to start in Paris this morning. I want to start in Hopewell. And I want to start in you. Because I don't know what to do about Paris. But I do know that Jesus gives me some things to do about me. And if we start there, like those disciples on the Sermon on the Mount, that later were the ones that turned the world upside down. They spoke of a different way, a way that comes from Him who said, you've heard it said, but I tell you. Don't just listen to him today. Live in to what he calls you to do. That, my friends, is our only hope. Let us pray. It is very difficult to make sense of these words today, Lord. They seem to challenge so harshly things that we might cast off so easily. But today you recognize that there's a virus in our soul that unless we let you be the vaccine that clears that out, we will find ourselves in a position that is equivalent to hell. So, Lord, help us this day to live into the freedom of your law and the life that you give through it. In the name of